In the previous section, I introduced you to RxJS and subjects. In this section, we'll now take a closer look at RxJS and at a concept called observables, which subjects in the end are. And we'll explore what exactly observables are, how we can create and use them, how we can use so-called observable operators to manipulate values created by observables, and we'll also compare observables to signals, which you also already learned about. And therefore, let's get started. What exactly are observables? So, what are observables in Angular? Well, first of all, it's not an Angular specific concept. Instead, it's a concept introduced by a third-party library called RxJS, which is independent from Angular, but which is used by Angular also internally in certain parts, and you'll see it being used by Angular in future course sections. And an observable, as introduced by that RxJS library, is in the end an object that produces and controls a stream of data, you could say. And later in the course, as mentioned, we'll use some Angular features that give us such an observable, so that give us such a stream of data. But to get started with observables and understand how they work, we'll simply create one ourselves. And that's what we'll do in the next lectures. So in order to work with observables and in order to create one ourselves, I prepared a brand new starting project, which you find attached as always. And if you then start that development server after installing all dependencies, you should see this simple page here on the screen. And currently, clicking this button won't do anything. And of course, the page isn't too exciting because in this section, we'll not build some kind of demo project. Instead, we'll just play around with that observables feature so that you get an idea of how it works and so that you know how you can work with observables if you encounter them as part of your Angular applications. Now, as I mentioned before, you already saw one special kind of observable in action in the last section where we got started with this behavior subject. This is a feature provided by this RxJS library, and the idea behind this subject in the end is an object that you can use to emit values to which you can then listen in another part of your application. Kind of similar to how signals work in Angular, but you'll also learn about the difference between these two concepts in this section here. And subjects like this behavior subject are in the end such a kind of observable because in the end with them you're creating and controlling a stream of data to which you can then listen in another part of your application. But subjects are just one way of creating observables, special kinds of observables that act as event emitters, to be precise. In this demo project, I'll show you a different way of creating observables and working with them. And for that, I'll start here in that app component, which is the only component I have in this dummy app here. And I'll start by implementing the onInit interface, which must be imported from Angular core so that we're forced to add this ng-oninit method. And in here, I now want to create a new observable with help of that RxJS library without creating a subject. Instead, we can import something from RxJS, and that something could be the interval function. Because RxJS gives you multiple functions you can use to create observables. Now you can find a full list of all the functions offered by this library and a description of what they do on the official website of this RxJS library. And as an Angular developer, you don't need to know all these functions, and you also don't necessarily need to know a lot about RxJS if you don't want to, though I will say that there definitely are Angular developers and teams and projects that fully embrace RxJS and might use it a lot. But just to work with Angular, you don't need to know that much about it nowadays, in my opinion. Nonetheless, here on this website, you, for example, find details about this interval function, and there you learn that this creates an observable that emits numbers every specified interval of time. And you then also find a usage example here on this page. So you could use this function now here in ng-on-init and call it. And as a result, you'd get back an observable that produces numbers. That's what this generic type here tells you. That's the type of value that will be managed by this observable that is returned by this interval function. So unlike this behavior subject we created before, this observable created with help of interval will now automatically produce values instead of doing that when we emit them, which is what we did with the subject. Here, the values will get produced automatically. And we also can't really control which kind of value will be produced here. And there are other creation methods where you can control it, but here with interval, you don't have that much control. Instead, here you just pass an argument to interval, which defines the time in milliseconds after which a value will be produced. So every 1000 milliseconds, a value would now be produced. And then you can set up a subscription by calling subscribe, just as you also saw it with the subject. So that's the same with any observable. In order to listen to the values that are emitted and in order to use them, you must set up a subscription. Now, just as a side note here about subscribing, you indeed need to subscribe to kick off the observable, so to say. By default, when you call interval here, it will not do anything unless you have a subscriber, because internally the RxJS library recognizes that if there's no one who's interested in the values, it doesn't make sense to emit any. So you need at least one subscriber in order to really kick off this interval. This subscribe method then takes a so-called observer object, which is an object that can implement up to 3 methods. A next method, or a next function, however you want to call it, that will be triggered for every new value that's emitted. And the emitted value will be received as a parameter here. And here we could then log that. In addition, you could also implement a complete function, which would be called if this observable would not emit any more numbers, though it depends on the observable whether this will ever be triggered. In case of the interval, for example, it'll by default keep on emitting, so the complete function might never execute there. And you can also implement an error function, which will be triggered if an error occurs, which here for this observable also shouldn't be the case, but which could be the case if you, for example, had an observable that's used for sending HTTP requests and then providing the response of that request. Something you'll see later once we dive into sending HTTP requests with Angular. Here, I'll only implement the next function. And with that done, if you go back, reload your page and open the developer tools, you'll see a new incrementing number being emitted every 1 second. And that number is now produced by that interval observable. Now, of course, this observable here isn't too useful. It could be, though, if you had an application where you need some kind of timer that fires every second. But even here, it's a good example for an observable that is created with help of this function that's provided by RxJS, which is now not like the subject depending on us emitting values, but which instead here, in case of the interval function, produces values automatically. And then we can subscribe to it, and just as before, with the behavior subject, it is a good idea to store that subscription and to clean it up when this component is about to be removed from the DOM, to make sure that you're not leaking memory and you're not having some ongoing observable behind the scenes that might not be needed anymore. Therefore, here I'll again inject this destroy ref with help of the inject function by importing inject and destroy ref from Angular core. And with that injected, we can use this destroy ref thing to register the on destroy hook here, so to say, where this function will be executed when the component is about to be removed. And it's in here now where I want to call unsubscribe to clean up that subscription. That's something you always want to do when working with observables, no matter how they're created. But with that, we now created and used this observable here.